My name's Nick Sievers. I work for Macomb Police Department. I've been employed there for about 4 years now. I locally grew up in Macomb, Illinois. I graduated from Macomb High School in 2013. Left and went to Iowa State University, and upon getting my degree, came back home, and I've been working here ever since. So as a canine officer, first it's a process where you apply for within the department. There's a testing process to it, and if you get accepted, you get sent to whatever kennel administration so chooses for you to go pick up a dog. These dogs typically come from overseas, and you'll go and you'll see numerous dogs in one sitting, and then you pick whatever dog that you think is the best dog for you and your department and your needs. And then you can go to multiple training venues throughout the United States of America and get your certification. So in Illinois, it's 120-hour minimum mandatory hour certification. So you go there, you train with your dog day in and day out. It's a full training day. It typically starts early and ends late. So I was for about a month in Indiana. Denver, Indiana was the name of the small town. Very, very small, similar to like a Colchester or a Good Hope. And the kennel there is Von Lick Kennels. All their dogs come from Europe. So we selected a canine from Hungary. His name's Mac. His name was actually Mark when we got him, which was a pretty easy transition to Mac. But we had a local gentleman donate some money towards us, and his nickname was Mac, so we named the dog after him. So that training process, it's a bit of building a relationship with the dog, establishing trust in him, and vice versa. So you have your blood, sweat, and tears legitimately. They have teeth, and sometimes they hurt, but you guys form a good relationship. And once you've done your initial training and you've put in those hours, you have to come back to Illinois, and your initial testing process is at Decatur. There's a Macon County Canine Training Center there in Decatur, and you go there and you do a certification test, which really is 20 PVC tubes. 4 of the tubes contain target odor, which would be your meth, heroin, crack cocaine. Crack is actually not out in this test, so it's just cocaine. And then cannabis, if your dog is imprinted on cannabis. The remaining tubes are either blank tubes, so there's no odor in it whatsoever, or they're proofing odors. So it would be dog treats, biscuits, tennis balls, tug toys. Everything a dog loves are in the other tubes. And you run your dog through that testing site, and you have to have your dog alert to the tubes that contain the target odor, the meth, cocaine, heroin, cannabis if your dog's imprinted on cannabis. And then you tell the assessor what tubes contain those target odors, and it's 100% pass-fail rate. So if you get one wrong, you fail the whole test, and you have to pass that test every year to work on the street in Illinois. So for him, cannabis is still out in that test as a proofing odor, because I have to show that he not only can smell cannabis, but he doesn't alert to it. So every day when we're training, I have cannabis out, so I can show that he's proofed off cannabis, so it's not an odor that he's alerting to, which would yield PC for us to search a vehicle. Detection initially will start with your observation when you're watching the vehicle, the probable cause to stop the vehicle. So a lot of times there's equipment violations, which could be light violations, the way license plates are configured on a vehicle, or there's moving violations. So if you see a vehicle that is crossing marked white lines, they're moving a very small amount within their own lane of travel, they've struck a curb and they've came back on the roadway. All those things are indicators of possible impairment, by either DUI, cannabis, or alcohol. So after that initial observation, once you pull that vehicle over, you're in the observation phase as far as what you see in those occupants, especially the driver. Is their speech slurred? Are their answers delayed? Are their eyes bloodshot or watery? What are you smelling? Are you smelling alcohol? Are you smelling cannabis? So the big thing is when you're communicating with that person, your observations that you're seeing, what they're giving you, if they're behaving in a normal manner or if they appear impaired by any means. And if they are impaired, then you're going to have them come out, and there's standardized field sobriety testing that we will do on the roadside. So those are some tests that give us indicators of impairment, and based off the results of those tests, that's what leads us to either an arrest or the standardized field sobriety testing that we'll do is the same ones that we do for alcohol. There are a couple additional tests that people can do if they've been to additional training. Modified Romberg testing is one of those. So it's a test essentially where you have your feet together, your arms at your sides, you shut your eyes, and you count to 30 seconds, the subject that's being tested. And while the officer's legitimately counting to 30 seconds on a watch or phone of some sort, just to kind of show if their ability to manage a situation is delayed or impaired. That's one test that's been linked to cannabis impairment. There's a few others, but a lot of times it's going to be really your questioning with the individual. The downfall right now, there's no tool that's being used on the road as far as, okay, I have reason to believe this person's impaired by cannabis. I go up, I have some sort of preliminary breath test where I can administer, and I get an immediate result to tell me how much cannabis is in their system. We do have that with alcohol, and they are making those for cannabis, and there are some that are being used across the United States right now, but there's not one standard unit that's being used like there is with alcohol. So in regards to cannabis consumption and transportation from a dispensary back to someone's home, the limit of cannabis they can possess is different for state versus non-state residents. So a resident can have 30 grams of flower, so essentially 1 ounce, or 5 grams of cannabis concentrate. For a non-state resident, that's going to be that number in half, so 15 grams or 2.5 grams. So those, first off, the cannabis has to be purchased from an authorized licensed dealer. So it can't be from Joe Smith on the street. It has to be from an authorized licensed dealer. That cannabis has to be in a sealed, odor-proof, child-resistant container, which is reasonably inaccessible while on transport. So although somewhat subjective, officer to officer, they have to meet that criteria. So what we're seeing now is a lot of people are having cannabis on their person, in their pocket, which would not be inaccessible. I think the reason behind that is they want to make it as hard as possible for those people to consume the cannabis while they're driving. Typically we tell people to put it in the trunk of the vehicle to where it's completely out of arm's reach and it cannot be accessed while they're in transport. The child-proof and odor-proof, the containers that it's sold in from a dispensary meet that. They're very sealed. You cannot smell them. I've seen many different packaging materials, and they are 100% odor-proof to human, at least to me. So I don't know if there's anyone out there with super noses that could be able to tell it, but I cannot smell it. So those are the standards that they have to meet, and no occupant of the vehicle, not even a passenger, can consume cannabis while the vehicle is on the roadway. The black market obviously was alive and well prior to legalization. That's how most folks were purchasing cannabis unless they had a medical reason to do so. So what I have observed, especially here in Macomb, there's not a dispensary in Macomb, so we don't see a ton of dispensary cannabis because people have to drive outside of Macomb to get it. So I think in communities where it's more readily accessible, you would see more folks going to those dispensaries. We still see a lot of black market cannabis because the people that have purchased cannabis here in Macomb for years through the black market are going to more than likely continue to do so because they're not going to drive to Canton when they could drive to Macomb and get it from someone that they've been buying from years. So we do still see a lot of black market cannabis. The issue with black market cannabis is it does lead to violent crime because when there's large amounts of cannabis and large amounts of currency in a residence that people know is a residence where cannabis is being sold, it leads to home invasions and robberies. So most of our violent crime is somewhat stemmed around the sale of some sort of narcotic, whether it's cannabis or an additional narcotic, because people know that that house contains either large amounts of narcotics, goods, whether it be televisions or electronic equipment, PlayStations, Xboxes, or currency. With legalization, I think you're going to see more people who are law-abiding citizens go purchase cannabis and consume cannabis. My only fear is that with the price from black market cannabis to legal cannabis from an authorized licensed dealer, it's much more expensive to go purchase legally sold cannabis. So people who could buy cannabis on the black market for half of what they'd probably pay at a dispensary are going to be more inclined to go pay a much better rate for black market cannabis than they would an authorized licensed dealer. Okay. So it's typically never a violent crime because someone's under the influence of cannabis or using cannabis. It's more the money or the cannabis, which is in a residence, which cannabis is being sold, which leads to violent crime. People are either aware that that house is a house that's selling cannabis, and so they know there's cannabis and money there, so that leads to violent crime when they come and commit a home invasion or an armed robbery or a robbery because they want the money or the cannabis. It's not people that are impaired by cannabis that are committing violent crimes in most regard. It's the money and the cannabis that come from whatever type of offense they decide to commit to get it. So the difference between legalization, decriminalization, and medical cannabis, legalization, it's completely removed from criminal code. So it's no longer in criminal code and there's no penalties for it. It's completely legal. Decriminalization, it's still in criminal code, but the penalties are lessened or not enforced, so discretion is used. And then with medical cannabis, you have to apply for a medical cannabis card. So if you get a medical cannabis card, it gives you the ability to go and purchase medical cannabis from a licensed authorized dealer, or you can also grow up to 5 plants in your residence. So I got some of the terms that are required to get a cannabis registry card. And so you apply to the medical cannabis patient program, and that's who administers the cannabis registry card if you meet the needs. But you have to be a resident of the state of Illinois at the time of your application and remain as a resident during your participation period in the program. You have to have a qualifying debilitating medical condition. I did give you a list of that if your students would like to refer to that. You have to have a signed physician certification unless you're a veteran receiving medical care at a VA facility. You have to be at least 18 years of age, not hold a school bus permit or commercial driver's license, and you cannot be an active duty law enforcement officer, correction probation officer, or firefighter. In 2019, prior to cannabis being legalized here in Macomb, we saw 24 individuals arrested for either possession or manufactured delivery of cannabis. Of those 24, there were 13 individuals that were given city notice to appears for possession of cannabis less than 10 grams. There was 2 people who were arrested for possession of cannabis over 10 grams and under 100 grams, and there was 9 people that were arrested for manufactured delivery of cannabis, which would be the sale of cannabis. So the difference between possession and manufactured delivery would be the amount necessarily, and then what their intentions are or what they're doing with the cannabis. So if someone possesses 30 grams of cannabis in 2019, it was a criminal matter. And so if they just possessed it, they didn't have scales, which indicated that they were weighing it for sale. They didn't have bags to package and deliver it to others. And they didn't have phone messages on their phone or social media sites that contained transactions of narcotics. It would just be a simple possession charge. But if we can show that the individual is possessing the cannabis and selling it, that's when the manufacturer delivery charge comes into play. So that means they're buying cannabis in a large amount and then they're redistributing it to others for financial compensation. So that would be the delivery portion of the cannabis. Okay, so in 2019, the penalties for cannabis, anything under 10 grams was a civil offense. So it was just a financial fine. It was not a criminal matter. You weren't arrested for that. You still could be issued a city notice to appear rather than a state citation, but the city notice to appear was just a financial penalty. In 2019, the criminal offenses for more than 10 grams but less than 30 grams of cannabis for simple possession was a Class B misdemeanor. For more than 30 grams but less than 100 grams of cannabis was a Class A misdemeanor, unless they have had a prior conviction, and then it's a Class 4 felony. So the real difference between the felony and the misdemeanor is going to be the seriousness of the offense as far as the time the person's going to spend incarcerated. I can't give you specific time frames on what a misdemeanor B to A, C to, or a felony offense would be as far as time incarcerated, but it's the amount of time incarcerated and it's the amount of money they pay for fines. And then to continue on with the penalties for more than 100 grams of cannabis, but less than 500 grams of cannabis was a Class 3 felony. For more than 500 grams, but less than 2,000 grams was a Class 3 felony. And for more than 2,000 but less than 5,000 is a Class 2 felony. I think I goofed that up. I think I repeated that one. So to reiterate, more than 2,000 grams of cannabis but less than 5,000 grams of cannabis is a Class 2 felony. And then more than 5,000 grams of any substance containing cannabis is a Class 1 felony. For 2019, those that were arrested, the demographic they fit is overwhelmingly males, and it's typically males between the age of 18 to 30. I do have specific breakdowns for 2019 alone that I will touch on for you. So in 2019, again, it was commonly folks between the ages of 18 and 30, overwhelmingly male. But here in the city of Macomb, there was 12 black males, there was 8 white males, there was 2 black females, and there was 2 white females. Most cannabis-related arrests take place on routine traffic stops. So an officer gathers probable cause to stop a vehicle. He makes that stop. He makes contact with the occupants of the vehicle. Oftentimes, the officer will either detect the odor of cannabis or will have some form of admission from an occupant that there's cannabis present in the vehicle, which will lead to a probable cause search of the vehicle. And then once the officer searches that vehicle, if he finds cannabis in more than 10 grams in 2019, it became a criminal matter. So that's where most of the arrests came from. A few of those arrests came from search warrants. The basis of those search warrants were the delivery of cannabis. So residences where we were either doing controlled buys from the residents, or we had some form of other reasoning to get a search warrant for the residents due to the manufacture, delivery, sale of any illegal narcotic, whether it be cannabis, methamphetamine, heroin, crack cocaine, and then the search warrant resulted in us locating cannabis and placing the individual under arrest. Specifically for my job has changed as far as enforcing the sale of cannabis and the possession of cannabis in 2020 due to legalization, to where now it's often seen in vehicles. People are more forthcoming that it's present, and it's giving us the ability to address it and not enforce, I guess for lack of a better term, we are seeing it so prevalent. It's in most vehicles that we stop, and in 2019 it tied our hands because it was still illegal in a way. Now we are able to see it, get communication from the occupants of the vehicle. They comply with us, they're honest, and we can send them down the road. So legalization is not tying our hands to where we're having to cite people all the time for cannabis being present in the vehicle because it's so prevalent in vehicles. So it's, I guess, freed our ability to not have to cite individuals repetitively and cause them financial burden because cannabis is so prevalent. However, it was decriminalized, but still a civil offense where we had to cite them. So now we were able to send people down the road and not have any sort of law enforcement action against them for being in possession of cannabis. So the legalization of cannabis definitely has allowed us to focus our intentions on possession and sales of methamphetamine, heroin, crack, and cocaine, narcotics that are proven to be negative chemicals in substances' body. They result in many folks losing their job, losing their children, losing their means of income, and we can focus our intentions on people who are using, abusing, and selling those illegal narcotics instead of having to focus our attention in cannabis, which cannabis, as my opinion as an officer, does not often lead to the negative things you see with other controlled substances like heroin, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine. I think in a university town, due to legalization, we're going to see more people consuming cannabis. We're going to smell cannabis in vehicles most of the time because of the younger 18 to 30 year old individuals that are using it. But it's giving us the ability to not have to enforce any sort of law enforcement action against them and redirect, our attention to violent offenders that are burglaring houses or robbing individuals or battering people. It's also going to, in my opinion, free up space in county jails and in prisons for violent offenders rather than people who are simply in possession of cannabis or selling cannabis. I think some of the drawbacks to legalization of cannabis are going to be how it's easily accessible for youth. We are seeing more youth who are in possession of cannabis than prior to legalization. I think a portion of that is it's so prevalent. They're able to get their hands on it easier. I think cannabis consumption is something that a 21-year-old or older can make a determination whether they want to use it or not. However, I don't think it's something that youth should be using, especially while they're developing and they're in school and playing sports and whatnot. So the access to it to youth is one problem that we're seeing. I do think some more negative effects for legalization would be a higher number of impaired drivers. With more people having access and consuming cannabis, we run the risk of having more people on the streets who are impaired by cannabis, putting the innocent motoring public at risk. In addition to that, I think there's a risk, and we don't have the data to show that this is factual right now. This is just my own personal belief, that with more people purchasing cannabis from authorized licensed dealers, we're now making it to where cannabis consumption and use is more prevalent. And my fear is that people are going to buy cannabis legally from authorized licensed dealers for the time being, law-abiding citizens. But in turn, if they see people who are purchasing on the black market for much less currency and getting the same amount and same type of product, I'm fearful that law-abiding citizens who are now purchasing it legally may turn to the black market to buy it for a better price, which could enable more drug dealers and more black market trade. So with transportation from cannabis from a dispensary to someone's home, The big thing I would suggest to students is it is in statute that it has to be regionally inaccessible while it's in transport. So I would highly suggest they either put it in their trunk where they cannot reach it while in the vehicle, as well as a passenger couldn't reach it. That's certainly going to be inaccessible. If they don't have a trunk, say they drive a truck or something where they don't want to put their product that they just spent their hard-earned money on in the back of the truck where it could be damaged or stolen, I would suggest getting some form of lockbox or something that they can put it in to where they're going to have to obviously pull over and use a key or a code or something within the passenger compartment, so it's not as easily accessible as just being in the center console where they could simply open the center console and grab it out and have it within arm's length. So I think some training that I would benefited from as a police officer that would be useful now on the street due to legalization is more tools, resources, tests to administer on the road that determine cannabis impairment, because we train and train and train on those in regards to DUI impairment, and I think that the research when I was in training just wasn't out there because cannabis was not legal at that time, so they weren't focusing on cannabis impairment on the roadway because it wasn't as prevalent. Now people are purchasing cannabis legally, they're consuming it legally in their home, and we have to have a standardized way to administer testing to make sure that those that have consumed cannabis and are now driving are not impaired. So I think we focus a lot of our attention on DUI alcohol training. I think if we could standardize some form of testing for DUI cannabis impairment, that would help officers be able to determine on the road whether someone is guilty of driving under the influence or not of cannabis. In regards to penalties to possession of cannabis, and this is simply just possession, this is not delivery. If someone possesses 10 grams or less and they're under the age of 21, it's still a civil offense. So anyone under the age of 21 cannot legally possess cannabis. However, there's no criminal charge against them. They'll be civilly fined for that possession. Anyone who possesses more than 10 grams or less than 30 grams of cannabis, which is not from an authorized licensed dealer, could be charged with a Class B misdemeanor. More than 30 grams of cannabis, but not more than 100 grams of cannabis, is a Class A misdemeanor, unless it is a subsequent offense, and then the offender will be guilty of a Class 4 felony. More than 100 grams of cannabis, but not more than 500 grams of cannabis, is a Class A, a Class 4 felony, provided that the offense under this subsection is a subsequent offense. The offender would be guilty of a Class 3 felony. So if they have prior offenses, it's always going to work against them in criminal procedures. More than 500 grams of cannabis, but less than 2,000 grams of cannabis, is a Class 3 felony, and then more than 2,000 grams of cannabis, but less than 5,000 grams of cannabis, is a Class 2 felony, and then more than 5,000 grams of any substance containing cannabis is a Class 1 felony. And the big difference there, misdemeanor offenses are obviously less than felony offenses. They're going to serve less time incarcerated if they do serve time incarcerated, and their fines are going to be much less for misdemeanors as far as in regards to misdemeanor versus felony fines. So I do think when college is in session here in Macomb, we will see more folks using cannabis because of that age range that I provided you. So the 18 to 30-year-old subject, typically male, is the typical demographic for the people that we have previously arrested for cannabis, and those that we commonly come in contact with who are using cannabis. So I do think when college is in session, we will see more cannabis use. I do hope if we're able to get a dispensary that can sell cannabis legally, we do see students and residents here in Macomb purchasing cannabis from that dispensary. It's going to generate revenue for the state of Illinois. It's going to make sure that they now have that cannabis and they have it legally, and they're not going to be charged criminally because they purchased it legally and they're abiding by all the transportation laws that we discussed. But my only fear is that people will again purchase cannabis from a licensed authorized dealer and then be upset with the price versus what they've been paying on the black market side of cannabis for the years prior, and then turn back to the black market. I think it's going to be the individual's own decision whether they'd like to possess the cannabis legally and be law-abiding, or whether they'd rather save some money and purchase it illegally and not be legally in possession and run the risk of being fined or arrested. I think another problem you're going to see too in regards to purchasing cannabis from an authorized licensed dealer is their hours. They're going to be open, 8 to 4, 9 to 5, whatever it might be. But I imagine they're not open on the weekends and they're closed on holidays. Well, people aren't going to stop consuming a product that they enjoy just because of it being the weekend or a holiday. So unless they've gone and planned ahead and they've purchased an amount, it's going to get them through that time where they can't purchase it from a dealer, authorized licensed dealer. They're going to turn to the black market on a Saturday night at 10 p.m. when they want to go purchase some cannabis they can consume with their friends, and the dispensary's closed. So it's leaving them, one option unless they've planned ahead and purchased enough to get them through that time period. I'm pleased with what we're seeing now. We're getting a lot of cooperation on the street, which is good. A lot of times, if I'm a big advocate of honesty and cooperation. So if I go up to a vehicle and hey folks, I'm Nick with Macomb Police, and the reason I stopped you today is the registration lamp on your vehicle is not working appropriately. I'll gather their information, I'll get their identification, and then I'll just question them, is there anything illegal in the vehicle today? No, there's not, sir. Okay, and then a lot of times I'll list out those things. So are there any firearms in the vehicle? Are there any stolen goods in the vehicle? Is there any methamphetamine, heroin, crack, cocaine, or cannabis? And a lot of people nowadays with the legalization of cannabis are saying, yes, I have cannabis, here's where it's at, this is how much I have. And that makes our job much easier because if we're smelling cannabis, which still at this point in time yields probable cause to search a vehicle, we can take that person's word for it. If we find the cannabis in that location, we're able to use discretion whether we act upon that. Because even if it's black market cannabis, technically they could still be cited if it's in violation of any of the odor-proof, child-resistant, sealed, inaccessible terms of the law. However, that honesty and cooperation from most officers who I work with leads to a mutual understanding of cooperation, and we send them down the road without any sort of fine or arrest. So when Nature's Grace first came to the area, they came and spoke with us. And when they came and spoke with us, we had the same situation you guys had when you spoke with them, the odor of cannabis. They're obviously growing cannabis legally. And when they first were in the area, if you'd patrol the east end of Macomb, you would get employees who had left Vermont and had come back to Macomb, and they smell like they have pounds and pounds of cannabis in their car. However, they'd just been growing cannabis all night. So that's one of those things. Technically, it'd still give you probable cause to search the vehicle based off the odor, but if you're getting cooperation from an individual who's not giving you any nervous behavior, they're being, again, honest and cooperative, and they have some sort of badge to show you, hey, I work here, because they require them to possess and wear a badge when they're at work. That's going to lead to an officer understanding why the presence of cannabis, the odor of cannabis is in the vehicle, which oftentimes will not lead to a search of the vehicle. So we did deal with that when they very first opened. I remember one particular incident, an officer told me, I thought I stopped a car that was just loaded down with cannabis. I mean, I've never smelled so much raw cannabis in a car in my life. And then I realized the person had just been growing raw cannabis all night. And I think one thing, as far as officer training and education, is being able to detect the odor of burnt cannabis versus the odor of raw cannabis. If a passenger in your vehicle purchased cannabis legally from a dispensary, he drove from the dispensary to his house with it packaged in a childproof, sealed, odor-resistant container that was inaccessible in transport. He goes to his residence, he smokes however much cannabis he legally purchased in his private residence, and then you pick him up. That officer needs to be able to determine, okay, that cannabis is burnt and not raw, because he's not in violation of the law. He did everything appropriately. So the individual who picked him up, who had nothing to do with the situation, who didn't use cannabis, and there's no other odor of raw cannabis in the vehicle, shouldn't be getting his vehicle searched because his passenger abided by the law. So it's a very big thing to determine whether the odor is raw or burnt, which is definitely different. I know when I was in training at PTI, at the Police Training Institute in Illinois, they had a day where they brought in cannabis, and we all smelled cannabis raw, and then they lit cannabis, and we smelt it in the room, and then they passed around the burnt cannabis so that you could determine and be able to write in your reports down the road that you've smelled cannabis, because it is an odor that provides you probable cause to search a vehicle, and then you smell the difference between burnt and raw.